Chapter 33. Law as Warfare. In Genesis 3:5 we encounter the tempter's plan for mankind. Every man as his own God, knowing or determining for himself what is good and evil, law and morality. This temptation is called original sin because, first, at the heart of all sin is the creature's will to be his own God and therefore determining for himself what constitutes good and evil. Second, it's called original sin because it is the first and key sin, the root of man's revolt against God. The fall of man is into this insistence on making all sin simply a relative matter, a question of personal choice, not of ultimate good and evil. This view has been made a matter of education's priority in our time. Most notably in the 1980s and 1990s, state schools, which, barring biblical teaching, have insisted in values clarification teaching that morality does not deal with absolute good and evil, but with purely personal and relative choices. Thus, it is held homosexuality may be a good choice for one person, but not another. Judgmentalism must be avoided, it's held, because morality is a matter of a personal lifestyle. Such a perspective is simply a present-day statement of Genesis 3:5, and it is basic to modern education. It is an ancient heresy. Marcion's good God was superior because he was not judgmental, and he was against law, in particular the law of the Bible and the Bible's God. A long-standing vein of Gnosticism within the Church has held to this antinomianism. It has replaced the antithesis between good and evil with the neo-Manichean antithesis between spirit and matter. It has therefore affirmed antinomianism and transformed Christianity into another religion. But the holy warfare of Scripture is not between spirit and matter. After all, Satan and his fallen angels are purely spiritual beings and yet totally evil. The holy warfare is a moral war, and the premise of the legions of God is the law of God. God's law tells us that good and evil are not relativistic terms, but basic ones that describe and set forth a fundamental and unchanging difference. The good expresses God's holiness, righteousness or justice, knowledge and dominion. These are communicable attributes of God which man must emulate, and this is done by obeying the law of God. The law of God tells us of his nature so that we know God truly, though not exhaustively in his law and his works. In a college textbook on sexual choices, it is held that, quote, self-respect and wholeness, end quote, should guide our, quote, moral, end quote, decisions. Our choices should be personal, not social, and these imperatives should guide our personal choices. Equality, responsibility, and honesty. This means that objective and absolute standards are denied in favor of personal ones. Of course, this quote-unquote free and quote-unquote liberated sexuality is not free from the basic premise it wars against, biblical morality. It regards God's moral law as the implicit or explicit enemy, and it has its own version of the holy war. Man, to be free, must wage war against God and his quote-unquote repressive laws. All law is a form of warfare, including humanistic laws. Speed limits war against all who drive too fast or too recklessly. Failure to pay taxes is seen as an attack on the state's life and is severely punished. The state must have laws or go out of existence, and the life of the state depends on the people's obedience to the state and its laws. God's law defends God's order. God's law sets forth God's justice, and obedience to it is necessary to the love and service of God. God's law tells us that there is a good and evil, and the Ten Commandments give us a summary of the law. The Sermon on the Mount defines the holy war more closely, and it requires our full obedience in word, thought, and deed. The difference between good and evil is not determined by man, nor by how certain acts affect us, but by the absolute and perfect being of God. The premise for our obedience is given in Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. There's a fundamental and total unity of being in the Godhead, no division, no disunity, and no conflict. When he speaks in and through his law, he gives us an undivided word and an unchanging requirement. God declares, I am the Lord, I change not, Malachi 3:6, which means that, because he is unchanging, so too is his law. Change and decay mark men and their ideas and works, but never God. Life is a constant warfare. Men are at war with their past and present, and with one another. The world is not perfect, and they seek to change it to match their ideas of perfection. From the Christian perspective, the world is sinful and fallen and needs redemption and change. Redemption by Christ's atonement, and then change to conform to his law or justice. The new creation does not abolish God's law any more than it sets aside the atonement. In the new creation, the atoned live in the perfect justice or righteousness of God. The antinomians who insist that they are not bound by God's law do not say the same about the state's law. They obey it, and in so doing, they unite with the chief priests who said about Jesus, "We have no king but Caesar," John 19:15. Which of these antinomians would welcome it if their children insisted that they were not bound by their parents' word? Or insisted it was enough to love their parents and that an insistence on obedience is legalism? Too much thinking in the church today is childish. It is resentful of any insistence on biblical standards, and it is eclectic, picking and choosing from the Bible as though from a buffet table. But such a perspective is an insistence on man's autonomy from God. If we practice the tempter's premise of Genesis 3:5 and insist on being our own God, it will not commend us to God if we at times use his word to buttress our word and our independence. As Cornelius Van Til stated it, the choice is between autonomy, self-law, and theonomy. God's law